We are getting very close to the Death Devil. One could call it the final stage of this story. However, before we get there, we have to set groundwork, the foundation for this final stage to take place. And what better way to do that than to bring things full circle and to reveal very vital information. Me, you, and every Chainsaw Man fan has read a chapter like this before. It sits in the middle of confliction. A lot of people tend to enjoy these chapters. Another set of people do not. And the reason for that is because of the inconsistency that Denji is played upon. This is a character that has gone through a tremendous amount of development, but there's always pockets where it reverts or spins back on itself. And every time it does tend to do that, more and more people tend to get upset. Perhaps this is mostly due to the fact that people think the development that is happening is now being reverted, that Fujimoto is taking away what growth Denji has had and spinning back 180 to diminish it. That is a valid side of observation. The other is that Denji is still just innocent, really not understanding himself properly, finding himself controlled, manipulated, or pushed against a wall to fall to his knees. And mostly it's in the face of a beautiful woman, his weakness. You'll notice very often that Denji's weaknesses constantly get exploited, but the ones that people tend to have problems with is the one relating to women. This is where Denji is more vocal, more playful, more backwards. It's almost like he gets nervous in front of his own growth. What he stands for, what he's visualized himself as, and what he's determined to do seemingly drifts away. Perhaps it makes for an unstable platform of growth, that the way Denji views himself but also all of his weaknesses are very much flexible. What this means is that the consistent growth that people have been comfortable with wasn't actually consistent to begin with, and more so pockets of specific understanding. And usually that specific understanding takes place under circumstances. When you pull back and look at the bigger picture of how Denji has developed through the story, it has not been linear. It has been under circumstances. And when you understand that the circumstances aren't consistent, they don't grow naturally over time, they're more so isolated to set events, his nature of a character starts to make more sense. It's easy to be upset with Denji's character because if you compare him to other stories that you're reading, he doesn't have a typical linear growth. 90% of the stories you're reading currently will have a character go from point A to point B to point C. Denji does it backwards. He goes from point C to point E to point F, back to point A to point B. There's never coherency on a larger scale, but on a smaller, isolated, once again circumstantial, you see the beauty within the moments. This one, for example, is meant to mimic Makima, but it does two things. It isolates Yoru's perspective and gives her a really good characterization in terms of her personality. At the same time of it mimicking Makima's personality and the events of Denji falling weak to her, he does the exact same thing here, but there's a difference this time around. While it still is aggressive pandering to Denji's weakness, he's curious. He's asking a question. He's trying to discern the difference between Yoru and Asa. And that leads you to one point of growth that I don't think people are currently noticing. He's curious on who actually assaulted him, but for the benefit of himself. So in a backwards way, he is putting himself first. He's curious and most likely wanting to know that Asa was the person that actually assaulted him when we know it was War. Yoru's personality overwhelms this situation quite a lot. It's nice to see her playful and energetic and sitting at the top. This is what she revels within. She loves being seen as this dominant upper echelon individual, someone that can't be stopped or conquered or looked down upon. But when you look back at the story, we know her weaknesses. We know the playfulness that she has. We know the subtlety that she has. Perhaps it speaks a lot to the full range of her character, seeing her like this at her pinnacle, at her peak, in her eyes, I imagine, compared to something more childish, tantrum-driven. It's hard not to view Yoru as anything but a egotistical child with a god complex. No one else knows this other than Asa, but I do find the reception towards how she's treating Denji rather interesting. We know how this outcome ends. We know that if Denji starts to fall back into that full controlled loop, it starts to spiral out of control. And I think a good example of people recognizing that is Yoshida and Fami. When they hear the plan of what Yoru wants to do, taking control of Denji and treating him like a dog, mimicking that Makima perspective, they look concerned, but understand that this has happened before. The curious thread that runs through that is the outcome. All of this is for an outcome. Denji's reaction to Yoru existing isn't all too fascinating. He's surprised and maybe a little bit curious, but he seems more so interested in Asa and what she's been a part of when it comes to the relationship that they've been building, oddly. That outcome, however, is always the same: to get Denji to be controlled by war. Indirectly, we have known about this since the beginning of part 2. This picture right here has foreshadowed that, and the reasoning behind it is to fight death. I do find it curious that Yoshida believes that Yoru, Asa, and Denji won't be able to take on death. They might be able to stand on the same battlefield, but death itself is just way too powerful. And it makes me question the legitimacy of how much they truly know about Pochita. Sure, they have some standard understanding, but from our knowledge, what we know, Pochita has gone toe-to-toe with the Death Devil before, and that's not on their own, but against all the other horsemen. While we may have not seen how that fight went down or the intricacies of it, it does make me question the legitimacy of how strong Pochita is or isn't. And in terms of legitimacy, the only thing that we have seen from Pochita is pure chaos, that he is an unstoppable force, that nothing can realistically stop him unless it comes down to semantics. If Pochita wants to erase things, primal fears can't really stand in his way. If Pochita wants to eat and consume and constantly revive, he can do it, but circumstances come into play. Denji comes into play. So it might really shape up the differences between a pure devil at heart compared to a human hybrid devil. Pochita, isolated away from human intentions, is exactly that, a natural born devil upholding what they represent. The same way that Yoru as a pure devil is the representation of war. The difference this time around when it comes to fighting death is that we have two individuals that are very powerful, now have human counterparts and human tendencies. And while Yoru might have a lot of power, she is now a lot more characterized. She's no longer just a devil. She's no longer just the theme of war itself. She is a living, breathing character with a ton of personality. That is important. The reason it's important is because they have to kind of work together. For them to fight death to any sort of extent, Denji needs to be weaponized. He needs to be a chainsaw by being controlled by war. So if you haven't already picked up on it, everyone's now currently on the same page. Fami was going her way about it, public safety were going their way about it, now they're all equally in the middle. There is an issue with this, however. It plays directly into Yoru's ego. When you give her that benefit, when you make her that leader, the only person that can probably defeat death right now is war, you're putting her on a pedestal that fuels her ego. And you notice that become more and more consistent throughout this chapter. She gets more and more confident and she starts to be cocky. So while Denji and Yoshida are having this back and forth in regards to Naoyuta, conversation they had about fighting each other to the death, Yoshida even giving Denji a gun to kill him, the person that steals it all away is Yoru. She is the one that initiates the attack and is on track to summon the gun devil to obliterate Yoshida right here. For an instance like this, it's difficult to tell what's going to happen next. While I could see Yoshida getting blown away entirely, a part of me thinks that gun isn't going to activate. There would be no reason for it not to, but I don't know why. Something in the back of my mind thinks that Yoshida and Fami, public safety, have planned for something like this, but it's hard to even figure out what they have and haven't planned for. So far, their motive, their goal, their operation has been in shambles since the beginning. Yet luckily, tripping over every single obstacle and step in front of them, they've made it to a destination that works. And right at the final hurdle, the final stage, Yoru is the one to ruin it all. It's hard to believe that the problem would be Yoru this entire time, that maybe she wouldn't be the one to cooperate properly. there is a thought that the previous altercations that Yoru and Asa have had with Yoshida and public safety has led her down a path of being manipulated as well, potentially forced into a contract, or perhaps just something that she doesn't realize. The issue with this idea though is that this was prior her having tank and gun. Now she has access to very powerful abilities, but maybe those powerful abilities are still under said jurisdiction or have transferred jurisdiction to the likes of public safety. So while she could still wield those tools, it would be a very funny reveal if the bang that she calls out at the end of the chapter doesn't actually work, and it's because Yoshida and public safety are still in control of the components of war. If this were possible, it would be funny to see her reaction to being partially caged. Her ego would not be able to handle that, and once again she would have to tiptoe around public safety. So while I can sit here and talk about all of these ifs and buts, truly, we don't actually know what happens next. It's hard to figure out where Fujimoto wants to take this story, but if there is one thing that is clear, we are moving towards perhaps the final arc, the final encounter, the reveal of the Death Devil, and the fight that will come from it. The question that remains is how much is already in motion, and will Yoru and Denji be able to pull this off?